with Australia. An ambitious target from President Biden's administration for 40% of electricity to come from solar energy by 2035. And who should pay to make homes greener? We'll be discussing that in today's Daily Debate. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. And we start today with allegations of broken promises after Sky News revealed how ministers agreed to bow to pressure from Australia to drop binding climate commitments from the UK-Australian trade deal. The chair of the Climate Change Committee says the UK is failing to show leadership on the issue after a leaked email showed how the Trade Secretary Liz Truss and the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng decided to drop two key targets from the text of the agreement. Well, among the areas to be removed was a reference to the Paris Agreement temperature goals. Now, back at COP21 in Paris in 2015, countries agreed to work towards limiting global warming to 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And you can see here on our data dashboard how we're already at more than 1.2 degrees of warming, that number going up the whole time. Well, our deputy political editor Sam Coates broke that story. Here's his full report.
Good morning. Have a beautiful London day.
The Australian Prime Minister in Downing Street just 3 months ago to seal, with a bump of the elbow,
Which one of you is going to get the better deal?
the UK's first big trade deal done from scratch with Australia. Tim Tams, penguins, plenty of banter. They agreed the principles of the deal and what seemed to be a shared approach on the environment.
We talked about climate change and the shared ambition we have to have a fantastic COP26 summit in November to reduce global emissions.
But Sky News can reveal that weeks later, the Trade Secretary and the Business Secretary gave in to a new Australian demand. A leaked email seen by Sky said that the Business Secretary has agreed that in order to get the Australia FTA, Free Trade Agreement, over the line, the DIT, Department for International Trade, can drop both of the climate asks, including a reference to the Paris Agreement temperature goals. One of the Conservatives' most senior environmentalists, who chairs the committee advising government on climate, was scathing.
If we're not prepared to hang our hat on the Paris Agreement, to which we have put our solemn promise and which we have put by law into action in this country, when we're dealing with Australia, which is one of the recalcitrant nations, one of the countries that's not doing what it ought to do, then really we're not taking the lead at all. And to do this at a time before COP26 is very serious.
The government insists that the forthcoming Australia trade deal will uphold the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But Australia made these demands for a reason, and it's significant that ministers went along with them in secret. Climate change is all about upholding commitments once the spotlight has moved on, rather than doing anything to help sceptical nations get out of their obligations.
The Australian scepticism comes despite wildfires that have ripped across the country in recent years. But a senior Australian politician made clear why dropping temperature targets was their red line.
I welcome the fact that the UK is recognising that we are no longer a colony of the United Kingdom. The UK does not get to decide what policies are put in place here in Australia. Keep in mind the Paris Agreement's non-binding. It's not law. It did not go through the US Senate. It was not considered a treaty. It's an aspirational agreement that a bunch of countries signed up to.
Green groups saw this coming in the UK-Australia trade deal, pleading in a letter to the Prime Minister earlier this year, saying it is not worth the rush to do a deal if the outcome causes significant damage to the planet. Last month, the Prime Minister responded, saying that the deal commits both parties to collaborate on climate and environmental issues. He said, "We are clear more trade will not come at the expense of the environment." That promise has been broken, says the head of Greenpeace.
The reason why he wrote this letter was because he was basically saying
trade and the environment cannot be separated. He said this is not going to be a race to the bottom. What this email shows is that that is just a barefaced lie, that actually what they're doing is the opposite. This is a race to the bottom, and it is a disaster. If the government is giving in on these environmental regulations, it is truly shocking, and it is truly seismic in terms of the impact that that will have.
Ministers still want a thumbs up on the deal within weeks. Australia is prepared to wait if needs be. That means compromises some might not like.
And Sam joins me from Westminster now. So, Sam, what are the implications of this for the UK government as hosts of COP26 at the Climate Summit?
Well, this is partly about Britain's leverage over Australia as we head into the COP Climate Change Summit. The backdrop with Australia is worrying, according to environmentalists. It was just this week, yesterday in fact, that we had a statement from the Resources Minister in Australia saying that coal was going to play a big part of that country's energy supply well into the 2030s. They're going head-to-head with the UN that's trying to persuade Australia to reduce its coal consumption. One of the reasons it's reluctant to have targets like the ones that have now been removed from the UK-Australia trade deal in internationally binding agreements. But I think, as you say, the greater significance is for UK ministers ahead of COP. The optics of taking out part of a binding agreement in secret that many environmentalists thought had been committed to by the British Prime Minister is not a good look, as here we are 51 days to go until that climate change summit begins. Climate change commitments are all are made at summits, but they have to be upheld over long periods when the spotlight isn't necessarily quite as focused on you. And I think it's this idea that commitments are being whittled away and watered down in private that could send a signal around the world of a way that Britain operates. It's the worst kind of signal that you can send at this point. And I think that's why today's story is so potentially damaging, even though government officials are trying to play down its significance.
Sam, thanks very much indeed. And a reminder that you can read more about this and all the other climate stories of the day on our website. Just head to skynews.com/climate. In today's other climate news, a scheme offering homeowners grants to reduce their energy bills racked up £50 million in administration costs, a watchdog has found. Now, that's the equivalent of £1,000 for each household that took part. Under the Green Homes Grant Scheme, homeowners could claim vouchers from the government to cover the cost of energy-saving improvements such as double glazing or roof insulation. The scheme was abandoned in March after reports of applicants not being reimbursed for construction. And we're going to be discussing how we can make our homes climate friendly and who should pay for it in today's Daily Climate Show debate. I'm going to be joined by Seppi Golzari-Munro from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit and Extinction Rebellion activist Chidi Oti Obihara. And that's coming up in a few minutes' time. The president of this year's COP26 summit says he's had constructive talks with China about their contribution to climate change. After several days of discussions, Alok Sharma said time is running out to prevent a climate catastrophe, adding that the choices China makes on energy shape our shared future. And critically endangered European eels can now access feeding grounds in a UK river before heading back to the Atlantic to breed, thanks to a new eel pass. The eels start their life off the coast of the US before migrating to Europe, but the number making the journey has fallen by around 95% in the last 40 years due to habitat loss and climate change. The new pass lifts the fish above obstructions to the River Hull, allowing them to continue their journey. To the United States now, where President Biden's administration has released a report claiming that the country will get 40% of its electricity from solar energy by 2035. Well, our correspondent Helen Ann Smith is in Washington for us. So, Helen Ann, tell us more about this announcement then.
Well, the report, Anna, lays out how what could happen, how much solar energy could be used to try and decarbonise the national grid here in America. This is certainly what President Biden would want to see. And the numbers are pretty stark, as you said there. 40% of the US energy could be provided by solar by 2035. That would be enough to power every single residential home. And in the meantime as well, that could create 1.5 million jobs, the administration says. Now, the look to solar, perhaps not a surprise. It's by far the cheapest renewable energy source. It's some of the fastest growing as well. And there's been a number of recent climate catastrophes here in America that not only highlight the need to act quickly, but have also highlighted some of the weaknesses in the energy grid here in America. Hurricane Ida, for example, just last week left thousands in Louisiana without electricity for a long period of time. And of course, remember as well, President Biden is the president who wants to be seen to take action on climate change. But of course, big targets, ambitious plans come with big challenges as well. At the moment, only 3% of the US energy is provided by solar. So that amount would need to be quadrupled in terms of the capacity added every year. So a huge challenge. And then, of course, the plan is quite broad at the moment in this report. There needs to be specifics, and those specifics need to make it through Congress. And here in America, where things like climate policy can be very politicised, that's not necessarily an easy or a guaranteed thing.
Helen Ann, thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. Coming up after the break, I'm going to be joined by Seppi Golzari-Munro, Acting Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and Chidi Oti Obihara, co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan. They're standing by already. Welcome to both of you. We'll be talking to them in just a moment, discussing that exclusive story about climate targets being dropped from the UK-Australia trade deal, plus how can we make our homes more climate friendly. Do join us next.
Like pulling us out of that little room.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave.
I'm Greg Milam, Sky's US correspondent here in Los Angeles. It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal. Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who've made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
I've seen the dark side of America. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. I've seen heartbreaking human stories.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
It's estimated that around 70% of our coastlines are experiencing increased erosion. We start with a steel structure that we put into the seafloor. We then pass a very small electrical current between what we call an anode and the cathode, and the structure itself is the cathode.
If we tried to use less energy, we could help reduce air pollution. What, like turning off the lights and stuff? Yeah.
Air pollution levels will improve over the next few days as the weather turns more unsettled and breezy. Heavy and thundery downpours will break out just about anywhere on Thursday, and it will still feel rather humid. There will be some brighter spells between the showers. Taking a look at the daily air quality index, where levels of air pollution are bandied from 1 being low to 10 being very high, predominantly low levels of air pollution are expected on Thursday as the weather turns more unsettled, cooler and breezy.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now, as well as challenging the solutions to them with Seppi Golzari-Munro, Acting Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and Chidi Oti Obihara, an Extinction Rebellion activist and co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan. So good evening to both of you. Really good to see you both.
Hello, good evening.
Earlier in the programme, we heard how Sky News has learned that the UK government agreed to drop binding climate commitments from the UK-Australian trade deal. Now, amongst the areas to be removed was a reference to Paris Agreement temperature goals. That aim to keep global warming to 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial levels. So should we sacrifice climate leadership for economic gain? Let's discuss this now. Seppi, to you first of all, how much do you think this matters? I mean, a trade deal with Australia is in UK's economic interest, isn't it? Do we have to accept sometimes that compromises might have to be made for the sake of trade and prosperity?
I think the first thing to say here, Anna, is that the notion that action on climate change and the environment is somehow at odds with prosperity is very outdated. It simply doesn't reflect market and social dynamics in the 21st century. In the UK alone, we've reduced emissions by roughly 42% while growing the economy by 78%. So the argument simply doesn't stand. But with reference to this leak regarding the trade deal, if true, it would be a politically baffling move, really. I mean, concern about climate change and the environment has never been higher. Brits now rate environment and climate as the second most important issue facing the country, second only to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's not clear to me whether this is really a vote winner.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The government certainly is playing it down. Let's take a look at some of what they've said in response to this story. They say our ambitious trade deal with Australia will include a substantive article on climate change. In fact, Chidi, they say that this is a first. It's the first time Australia will have ever included climate provisions in a trade deal, even if those specific temperature targets aren't included. So what do you make of that response?
Well, I think the response is a way of trying to ameliorate fairly complicated issues. And one of them is the fact that Australia measures its own climate progress in different ways from us. So they've talked about going from 26 to 28% decreases in their emissions compared to 2005 levels, whereas the UK talks about reducing by 68% from 1990 levels to 2030 levels. Now, there's a lot of complicated mathematics that goes on within this, but nothing hides the fact that Australia houses 79 out of the 176 new coal-fired power stations that are being set up globally. Australia is trying to get out of its own Paris Agreement commitments by not committing appropriately to the Paris Agreement commitments the UK has within this free trade agreement. And that's wrong. The UK should be setting an example, not following laggards.
Well, Seppi, I think Australian ministers would say they are committed to the Paris Agreement, but they may argue we have got a lot of jobs in the coal industry. And if you're a UK trade negotiator, what are you supposed to do if you come up against that argument? Are you supposed to abandon the trade deal? What would you do?
I'd say, Anna, honestly, the question is not which jobs we lose by going net zero and by addressing the Paris Climate Agreement. It's actually which jobs we lose out on if we don't. And there's no denying that there are jobs in carbon-intensive industries, but there are plans, and there will be plans developed to help retrain and transition those people. And I think, the key thing to remember here is the world is moving on. already at least 2/3 of global GDP is covered by net zero targets. And many businesses are already getting ahead of this curve and setting themselves earlier targets, bringing jobs in the process. I mean, in the UK alone, over the summer, we saw, 6,000 jobs for battery tech in Coventry, another 6,200 for battery tech in Sunderland, another 1,000 in EV production in Cheshire. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We can see actually net zero breathing life into Britain's former industrial heartlands. And it's really a case of actually seeing the opportunity here, seeing that businesses are innovating and bringing jobs, but recognizing that there are those that are affected that need to be, helped and supported to retrain and transition.
On the risk of missing the point of what's being discussed here, because it's really, really important to focus on the fact that Australia is a nation that hasn't been able to meet some of the most obvious targets for cutting emissions, some of the most obvious projects, such as stopping issues like the Adani mine project, one that's so big that it's visible, a coal mine so big it's visible from space. If the UK is going to have trade agreements with countries like Australia, the UK can't spend time placating them. The UK has to actually set an example that others follow. This is the year of COP. And Britain is, after all, Britain. I know that we've come out of the EU and we thought we were going to be able to solve some of the problems of the common agricultural policy. But it's a really big missed opportunity if we try and get trade agreements that are set up with no reference to Paris temperature goals. I think that's unacceptable.
OK, let's move on to the other subject we wanted to talk about, which is that it's been revealed today that the government's Green Homes Grant scheme cost £1,000 for each household that took part just in administration. Now, the initiative was scrapped in March after facing problems with delivery. But making our homes more climate friendly is going to be key if the UK is going to meet its climate targets. So how can we make our homes greener and who should pay for it? Chidi, to you, first of all, it was a pretty damning assessment by the National Audit Office about the Green Homes Grant. So looking to the future, how do we go about making our homes more energy efficient?
Well, what we need is a properly administered government program so that we get a just transition in the process. There are no routes out of energy poverty that don't include renewable energy. So when the National Audit Office says that the 12-week timetable that the Treasury Department set for this entire program for 600,000 homes in the middle of COVID last year, when they say it was overambitious, the National Audit Office are actually being incredibly diplomatic. What basically happened was a really good, very important scheme that would have delivered hundreds of thousands of jobs and saved hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 fell apart because the way it was administered and the period during which it was administered just didn't allow it to be effective. We need to do what the IPPR suggests, which is go back, focus on local delivery, focus on local people, focus on job creation, and carry out the Green Homes Grant that 62% of the public were about to apply for until it was cut prematurely.
OK, Seppi, I just want to explain why we're talking about this, why it's important, because there is a statistic here from the National Housing Federation that shows that England's homes produce more carbon emissions every year than all of the country's cars, which is an extraordinary stat, isn't it? But it's expensive, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to insulate people's home, put double glazing in, you're going to take out people's gas boilers, it all costs money. So who pays for that? Is it the individuals? Do we pay through the tax system? How should we pay?
I mean, you raised the really important points. And the reason this is all being discussed is there's actually a vacuum at the moment whereby, we're waiting for a heat and building strategy to come from the UK government. We were anticipating that before the summer. It's now looking like it's coming in before October. And that is, critical, and not only in setting a date for phasing out gas boilers, but also actually setting out some policies that can actually help support people.
Apologies for cutting you off, Seppi. We're out of time. We'll discuss this another time, I promise. But Seppi and Chidi, thanks so much for joining us here tonight. And that's everything from us for today. Joining me on the show tomorrow will be economist and former joint head of the UK's Government Economic Service, Vicky Price, and the Independent's climate columnist, Donncha McCarthy. Do stay tuned. Coming up next on Sky News tonight, Tory MPs are expected to approve the highest tax rise for decades, breaking one manifesto promise on tax to pay for another